biggest use for AI very rapidly for FDA would be in knowledge management. They have never figured out how to manage their precedents, right? And where lawyers used to have huge libraries of books that were packed with the precedents, FDA, it was all in the document room in individual files. Now with AI, there is possibility of bringing this together so the individual reviewer can find out how a similar situation has been dealt with historically, and that will be a tremendous benefit.
Hello, and welcome to bonus episode 2 of FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines. I've been involved with FDA for many decades and have authored or edited 16 books about the agency.
And I'm Shelly Garg. I'm the managing partner and founder of Garg Law, a full-service FDA-focused law firm. I have been on the private side advising companies on regulatory compliance and enforcement for the last 15 years.
So hopefully you're already subscribed to the podcast and have listened to bonus episode 1, featuring a discussion with Mark Scheinison and Steve Grossman about how the transition was evolving. Today, in bonus episode 2, we're going to be discussing the administration's nominee for FDA Commissioner, Dr. Marty Makary, what issues FDA is facing now, and what issues the agency should be focused on in the future. And we're going to be talking with the most distinguished manager that FDA has ever had. I've introduced our guest many times, and I always say that because I don't think anybody has ever disagreed with me. Janet Woodcock just retired a year ago from FDA. She can receive credit. She doesn't claim credit, but she would receive credit for creating the modern system of the regulation of drugs, and also was deeply involved as Deputy Commissioner in the creation of the new food framework. So she's familiar both with drug issues and with food issues. Welcome, Janet. It's an honor to have you here on our podcast.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here.
Let me start out by asking you a question, and that is, we've all been through changes at FDA in the past. Based on your experience, what do you think will actually happen in the future at the agency with regard to retaining staff, with regard to basic policies, with regard to how communications with sponsors is going to go? Look into your crystal ball and, give us a sense, because, again, when I was at the agency, we went through not an upheaval like this, but certainly, a lot of change. So change is always in the air at FDA.
Yes, well, I think there are different levels of this question and different kinds of concerns. At the very basic level of having the staff necessary to do the work, I think that's an issue. It's going to be an issue because people may be uncertain about joining the federal government. For technical people such as physicians, statisticians, you name it, people with biomechanical engineering background and all the different technical groups that are needed at the FDA, most of them have other options that pay more. And it was always attractive to go to the government. I mean, that was one benefit of the government. It was felt to be a stable situation. And if that is less the case, if the government's going to resemble private industry more, the fact is private industry can offer higher salaries, but of course not the job stability that was people kind of took for granted in the government, although that wasn't necessarily the right approach. So that's something the FDA has struggled with for a long time. One of my last efforts at the agency, as you alluded to, was reorganizing both the foods program and the FDA field. And the field had languished for a long time in a very, very old model. And part of that was hiring people maybe just out of college with, and just a small number of hardcore courses, whereas we have like agricultural colleges that offer degrees in food science. We have advanced degrees in many things you could hire. So we attempted to upgrade that so that people can hit doing actual inspections earlier, because of course the FDA was being dinged, and there was considerable concern about inspectional coverage, both in the United States and internationally. Now, if they have fewer people, they're likely going to be able to do fewer inspections. And if the federal jobs are less attractive, it means it's going to be more difficult to do recruitment, especially at the higher technical levels. Because don't forget, science and technology is really advanced and is advancing at a very rapid rate. And so we the people of this country, if we want regulation, it needs to be commensurate. It has the same technical abilities as the industries that are regulated, or it's going to be a mismatch. So I think that's a problem. Now, moving on, and we can stop here and you can comment on that, but moving on to the policy area, okay, and how is that going to evolve? I don't think we know yet. There have been many signals from the new administration. Number one, signals about bureaucracy, but also signals about stifling innovation and need for change. And so how that's going to play out, I think, is in the hands of the folks who, not yet confirmed, but when they take over, they're going to have to figure out what they stand for clearly and articulate that so that so the staff can move in that direction.
Yeah, Janet, over the years, we've talked about the difficulty of recruiting, and if you could talk a little bit about that, because we were one of the main recruiters for the staff at Cedar, but also in terms of the field, I don't think that people understand the the ability of the inspectors and the need for them to be highly trained. And if you have inspectors leaving or having to do more inspections, that's a different kind of problem entirely. So if you could address recruiting and the inspection force and what kind of expertise they really have and what they need.
Yeah, well, the inspectorate is now inspecting everything from people who are making gene therapies to the sites that make CAR T cells, right? Or the sites that administer CAR T cells, or the clinical trial sites for all of those. Also, the foods program is just incredible as far as their responsibilities include, all the FDA regulated foods in the United States, the borders, so making sure that the food that comes in is okay, and then training all the inspectors from the states in the United States and making sure they understand the standards, and then making sure all the international sites that are exporting food into the United States are meeting certain standards. And this is just a tremendous job. And also, so in foods, you have everything from this agricultural science of the farms. We don't want the horse feedlot or the cattle feedlot to be beside the lettuce fields, right? Because the runoff will have that manure in it. And these, people are gradually becoming more sophisticated about all these things. So that's agricultural science, but then we need food science. Look at what happened with infant formula. Okay, we had contamination by a human pathogen of this large-scale food. So the all the inspectors need have a very good background in whatever area they're inspecting to understand the standards and to implement them properly and so forth. So the field's idea was to hire people with just a very basic college education in science and then train them up. And that was when everybody inspected everything. They inspected warehouses, they inspected, whatever, drug facilities, but we didn't have gene therapy. Okay. We didn't have all these extremely complicated technological, look at devices. So the field needs to shift to a model where they hire more highly trained people and then train them on the standards for manufacturing or whatever clinical trials, whatever they're inspecting. And they have that basic knowledge already. And this is going to, you have to pay them more. These jobs are not easy. These folk have to go often into different countries where the people may be hostile and speaking different languages, and they need to inspect those facilities and get out unscathed without like having many of the perks that they have in business, where you can do business travel and you can stay in better accommodations and so forth. So these are not easy jobs. The people are away from their family a lot, and so what do we see? We see a huge amount of turnover there, just like we do in the review staff, because one of the problems on the recruitment side for review across the agency is these people are hired, they're trained for a couple years and a couple more years, and they're thinking, well, my children are going to have to go to college, and they're recruited into industry. And so the FDA is involved in this constant wheel of recruitment, training, getting people, and then they have the credentials. They've been FDA, whatever, as reviewers, project managers, inspectors, and they are very marketable. And of course, the industry salary is very desirable. So we see this constant circle of having to keep recruiting people and training them.
Janet, how do you think, companies should operate in this area where there's a lot of either indecision or lack of clarity? You know, Personally, on my front, we have a lot of companies that are pending FDA response on various issues. It's been almost 10 weeks, that there's no response. And so I think with issues, you spoke about kind of qualified inspectors and folks within HFP that are trained. How should companies operate in this sort of unclear landscape at the moment?
Well, I think they just have to do the best they can with goodwill. I mean, the um, agency people, especially on the user fee side, I mean, they have obligations to meet timelines and deliverables and so forth. On the foods, less so, of course, but the people at FDA are dedicated to the public health mission, and
Right.
that means doing their jobs. And so I think we need to extend some grace here and thinking they're trying to, as best they possibly can, do their jobs right now. And we'll just have to see how this plays out.
A year and a half ago, you were deputy commissioner of the agency. You know, just looking at it broadly, what are the biggest issues that the agency really faces? Just to Dr. Califf, as he was leaving the agency, talked about AI and the need to regulate AI and the need to adapt to AI. Talked about the Loper Bright court decision. From your perspective, what are the big issues that the agency needs to face, independent of the skirmishes that are going on right now?
Yeah, well, I tend to look at the big picture and see, then look at operationally what needs to change. Clearly, the past way of doing things, say in drug regulation, biologics, so those uh, need to change. We need to move from writing what I call deathless prose, both on the side of the industry and then deathless prose on the side of the agency, to exchange of data from probably a cloud platform. We're making big strides in that. For example, we need to move away from individual countries' review of manufacturing and manufacturing supplements to a worldwide quality review. So we have the same drug around the world, and we're not 50, 60 different regulatory authorities aren't tinkering around with the process and the specifications, so that we have the same drug. And that will clear the way for a tremendous amount of innovation. I think the Device Center has been amongst the most innovative because they've been driven to it, okay, by the sheer volume of the products that they have. Um, AI is just one example of the kinds of new technologies that will probably require new approaches. Right now, I'm working on developing a proposed legislative change to the substantial evidence, not to the standard, but the way you can meet the substantial evidence standard for drugs and biologics. And for rare diseases, because the current approaches that have been used for common diseases are not working for rare diseases. So that's another big change that has to happen. I also think, similar to AI, the technology, some of these more platform technologies like different ASOs, gene therapy, and so forth, where they're going to be individualized precision medicine approaches. We need to move away from the each one as a separate IND ad nauseum approach to a platform approach. These are huge, big policy shifts that are driven by science, right? And I think they're going to have to occur no matter what type of administration is in place. And I'm not sure how these things occur, but I'm going to be agitating to make them happen. So, in my mind, those are some of the challenges. The foods program just needs to be modernized. I mean, the way they have to do things does not enhance any speed. It's, very slow. And if you recall, I worked with Congress and the industry. We were able to change the OTC monographs to something administrative orders so you could keep up with the science and move more rapidly. And I think something has to be done about foods so that the foods program is able to keep up with the science.
Janet, we'll move to a different topic now, AI. We know that FDA is actively engaging with AI in the context of drug development and regulation. What do you think FDA needs to do to make AI viable for the agency in terms of drug development and expediting clinical trials? Um, can FDA afford the investment that it needs to regulate and adapt to AI? What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it really depends on the use case, what you're talking about. All right. So, Amgen just and Accumulus just said they just submitted off their platform. They submitted to a whole bunch of agencies the same CMC supplement or whatever, and Amgen is starting to assemble those using AI. You know, there's nothing really inherently concerning about that. Right now, they use different CROs to write up all this different stuff, and so whereas use of an AI in deciding what to do about a patient is a different matter. But companies are using AI in drug discovery, drug design. These things do not really concern the agency very much. As far as internally, the biggest use for AI very rapidly for FDA would be in knowledge management. They have never figured out how to manage their precedents, right? And where lawyers used to have huge libraries of books that were packed with the precedents, FDA, it was all in the document room in individual files. There was no way. They use institutional memory of their leaders. Oh, this is how we managed this situation in the past. Now with AI, there is possibility of all bringing this together so the individual reviewer can find out how a similar situation has been dealt with historically. And that will be a tremendous benefit. But that means, everything has to be digital for it to be accessed. And, I think Cedar and a bunch of the places are pretty far along in that. I think most of them are. But as far as cost, I don't know. I mean, I think FDA can manage the AI costs. I think they're, well, that's another big problem the agency had that I tried to work on when I was there. I was stymied to a great extent, and I'm unhappy about it. But I worked with Vid Desai, who's the CIO. FDA has a very, very fragmented IT environment that is very, very expensive. And so, they keep doing individual development in every center. And so they have their own individual servers and this and that and the other, and a very expensive way to do business. And what I did when I was there is try to set up at least a workflow management program for inspections. So the place ordering the inspection could communicate on the platform with the field, and then the inspectors could enter their stuff in there, and then it could go back to the other people and maybe the compliance people all in one platform rather than using emails and faxes and all this kind of stuff. That has encountered a lot of problems, as you might expect, but those are the kind of things they need to make more enterprise systems compared to what they have.
I want to shift gears a second and talk about some of the things that you're doing. One of the projects I understand that you're involved in is trying to identify new uses for abandoned drugs that have been tested. Talk a little bit about that project and what you hope the prospects are for success there.
Yeah, well, there are different parts of this. There are several groups. I'm working with Every Cure. It's hard for me to remember all these names of everybody, but David Fajgenbaum and his group at Penn, okay, and they're working on using AI to look at the pathways that approved drugs interact on, look at what's been identified in academia as pathways that are implicated in disease and matching these up, and then surfacing candidates that might be useful for repurposing. This is going very well. They have pretty good funding. I'm just advising them, but I think this is a very promising area. There's another set of projects people are working on that I hope to help them on in more the policy area to make sure that such repurposed products, should they prove useful, can be reimbursed at a reasonable rate, right? So that people can access them. So that's one project I'm working on. There's very little. Certainly, the generic industry isn't going to put money into finding how their generic products can work for rare diseases, for example. So somebody has to do it.
Thanks, Janet. We're going to take a quick break, but don't go anywhere because we'll be right back.
And we're back. We're talking with Janet Woodcock, who a year ago left the agency after many decades of leading the drug regulatory system and also recreating the food oversight system. Again, we're honored to have Janet on our podcast here today. Shelly?
Janet, we're curious to understand, whether there are any areas where FDA's authority needs to be expanded or reconsidered to more effectively regulate emerging healthcare technologies, and just what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, not a trick question or anything. Yeah, well, obviously in the foods area, it depends on what you want to do with foods. The FDA's authority is actually very limited in foods. It's mainly about contaminations, as you know, both chemical, toxicological, or microbial or virus, right? With
Hmm.
some labeling authority baked in, with the nutrition facts and so forth. And then that's about it. Okay. Except for certain programs like infant formula and everything, special nutrition type of things. So foods would be one but that would mean that there would be societal congressional interest in changing the authority, being more interventionist in that area. Now, in the medical product areas, much of the problem, and veterinary as well, much of the problem is the age of the statutes. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is pretty old, and many of the provisions in there were put in long ago. Okay, so for say take take generic products that are a combination and have a device in them, all right, say an inhaler. Well, those are really needed by a large number of people use inhalers, right? And it's very useful to have them go generic when they're eligible. However, I think the statutes really never contemplated these type of products when they were first passed. Generics were drugs, and the drugs were pills, basically, or shots, right? And this theme that I'm talking about pervades much of FDA regulation. And the Chevron decision, the decision that countermanded, you might say, the Chevron decision, doctrine or whatever, said that there should be more adherence to what Congress intended. The problem with these really old statutes is, Congress didn't even know about these things because nobody knew about them. And so what the agency has done is try to evolve their policies and thinking to bring in new technologies and get them under this original statute, because they were always intended to be regulated. But but this means stretching sort of what was originally intended. And I was always on the camp when I was in the agency, let's get this changed. Let's talk to Congress and get this changed. But there was a huge camp that said, no, Congress will make things worse. Let's not do this. Let's just try to, wiggle around it, reinterpret this, push it and everything. So I don't know how this recent court decision will affect those tendencies, but it is a problem that statutes concerning technical entities like regulated medical products get a little bit long in the tooth, all right? And it isn't like their basic provisions are wrong. It's that their scope or the way they need to be applied is different depending on new circumstances. So it's a big problem.
Let me ask you a question about the cost of drugs. FDA officially has no role in the cost of drugs, but unofficially, obviously, it gets involved, whether it's advancing generic drugs, whether it's dealing with CMS and all the like. Just talk generally about what role you see FDA having, not in setting the cost of drugs, but in influencing the cost of drugs. That is an issue for every administration, the Biden administration, the Trump administration. Both have expressed concerns, as we all do when we, go to the pharmacy and when we see our doctors.
Right. Well, the cost of drugs has two aspects to it in my mind. In the United States, drugs may cost too much, and they also cost too little. And let me explain that. Okay. The new drugs prices, and I don't, FDA and certainly I don't have any influence on how they're made or whatever, are out of reach for many people. And so people with serious diseases either have to sell the farm, so to speak, or they can't access maybe life-saving therapy, and that isn't good. On the other hand, we're seeing fewer and fewer generic firms stay in business in the United States because the prices are so low, and they just can't compete. And it's also the root cause to a great extent of the fact that they let their factories go and they're not really upgrading and modernizing. You can't just operate a factory for 20 years and not put any capital investments into modernizing it and so forth, because things wear out. So I think there are problems on both sides. FDA's interest is that people have access to the drugs that are available. And therefore, the generic thing is enhancing competition. It still doesn't set the price, right? The cost of the drug. What FDA does is put more competitors on the market. Same with the biosimilars program, so that hopefully the price, and that is shown in the data, that the price will go down if there's enough competition in the market. And so FDA's tried to do that, tried to streamline the path for generics, worked hard. I worked hard to get the biosimilar pathway established in Congress. That was quite a fight. and so forth. So, and also, of course, things like I was talking about earlier, the worldwide manufacturing approval using advanced manufacturing, new trial methods, and so forth that are more effective. All of these things improve sort of the runway to getting for patients getting access to effective therapies. But yeah, FDA doesn't intervene then in how the drugs are priced or reimbursed.
But again, um, talk a little bit about the relationship with CMS. Some people have described it as a wide chasm and difficult to navigate. You've got as much experience as anybody at FDA and dealing with CMS.
Right. Well, CMS, it has a very different framework, statutory framework. Too many of their things are driven by their actuaries and the calculations that they do and so forth. And so it's a very different framework than what FDA operates under. And I think that's the reason for the perceived chasm because they, for example, they were directed not to pay for weight loss drugs by Congress, right? So what do you do about that? There's not much FDA can do about that. Eventually some of those drugs got indications for other medical indications that allowed them to be paid for by Medicare, but they have to stay within their statutory framework. FDA has to stay within its statutory framework, which is drugs that are approved that are safe and effective, even if they cost $1 million. So when people think about how to reform the systems, they have to think about where they want to apply those reforms.
Janet, just a question on the food side. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what steps the FDA is taking to collaborate with international bodies to really ensure global food safety standards are being upheld, and really working with other countries to prevent unsafe food imports from affecting American consumers. How do you think FDA is approaching international collaboration?
I think they're doing very, very well on that. And then during the reorganization, we combined all those functions in an office within the Human Foods Program, so that all those kind of functions are together. And they have several types of different arrangements with different foreign regulatory authorities or different countries. Basically, they're all directed at making sure that the food that is produced will meet the FDA standards, not just country standards, so that if it were imported into the United States, it could be deemed acceptable, without being held up or anything like that. And I think, they're doing a pretty good job on that.
I want to ask you about a project that you were intimately involved in, which everybody knows about, Warp Speed. You were responsible for the therapeutic part of that. It was, in my view, one of the most successful programs that the government has ever run. The development of two vaccines within less than a year, the development of therapies. What are the characteristics of Warp Speed? What are the lessons to be learned from that experience, and how should they be applied to drug development and also vaccine development?
Well, I think part of it was money. People put people were willing to put a lot of time, attention, resources against development, both of, say, the monoclonals as well as the vaccines, and that sped them along. Another thing was there was available technology, both in the vaccine space, although none of that had been most of it hadn't been approved yet, but in the vaccine space, as well as the monoclonals had been around for a long time in the therapeutic space, as well as the different antivirals. So you could build on that technology and not kind of be reinventing the wheel, because this speed was totally unprecedented, including for the monoclonal antibodies, to get them invented, tested in vitro, expanded, developed, tested in the clinic, and then becoming available, was nothing short of miraculous. But there were a lot of efforts that were done in collaboration amongst the companies, collaborations amongst governments. I think the FDA was very helped in the vaccine area by data from Israel and from Scandinavian countries, and where they had national health systems, and so they were able to track their vaccinees very carefully and look at the side effects and so forth. So there's a lot of sharing of data internationally and so forth. All of those characteristics, most of them can be applied to many development programs. And of course, within the agency, they were on their own warp speed. They had speedy development programs. They moved the applications, INDs, and so forth for COVID to the front of the line. They were, working 24/7 for a lot of the time. So some of it can't be sustained. That kind of effort cannot be sustained over the long term unless you add more staff.
Janet, one final question. Are there any, new medical innovations on the horizon that you're seeing?
Well, I was there really for the beginning of monoclonal antibodies, and it took, in my mind, 10, 12, 15 years for them to really become mature. I was at the FDA when French Anderson did the first experiment of gene therapy
Mhm.
in the United States, and it's taken a long time, but I think it is becoming a mature technology that it still takes a while for these things to really come to fruition. But I do think, and then the cellular therapy actually harnessing biology itself to modify disease. I think we're just seeing the beginning of that, and it's going to become much more sophisticated, hopefully less heroic of an intervention over time. So I believe, like many things, these things take time. It's going to be 5 or 10 years, and we're going to see a tremendous revolution in how medicine is done, based on precision medicine,
Mhm.
which most of these approaches are, as well as all the genetic base, like the ASOs, RNAi, all this kind of stuff that people are trying. So I think one of the points about all this is that they are precision approaches. I think in some diseases like cancer, we're going to have to use multi dimensional assessments in adults of, mutations, combine those into combined biomarkers, target therapies. We're going to see AI design of molecules that's actually going to be faster and better than how, we've had to do it by hand before. So I think all these kind of and the devices are just incredible nowadays, and they're only going to get, say, smarter over time. So these things have been incubating for a while, and now they're starting to take off.
Thanks, Janet. And on that note, Wayne, it's time to thank our esteemed guest, Janet Woodcock, for really being such an excellent guest on this second bonus episode. We'd like to also thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, and our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister.
And Shelly, this is where we let our subscribers and listeners know that if they want to suggest a guest for our show, or want to be a marketing partner or sponsor, or just want to comment, they can contact us at info at fdawatch.net. Again, info at fdawatch.net. And definitely check out our website, fdawatch.net. And please do encourage anyone who might be interested in FDA to subscribe to our podcast. Finally, we'd like you to, if you're inclined, give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. It really does make a difference. And again, remember to follow us and subscribe. That's the only way to make sure you won't miss a single episode of FDA Watch, including our bonus episodes like the one you're listening to now.
And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.